Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint meeting of the Air Quality Advisory Board and the Larimer County Environmental Science and Advisory Board. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to hear information prepared by air resource specialists on the Martin Marietta air permit. My name is Lucinda Smith. I'm the City of Fort Collins Environmental Services Department Director, and I'd like to welcome the board members and the members of the public. Before I go any further, I'd also like to introduce our elected officials who are here tonight. We have Lou Gator, Larimer County Commissioner, Steve Johnson, Larimer County Commissioner, and Ross Cuniff, Fort Collins City Council member of District 5, and also the Council Liaison for the Air Quality Advisory Board. Are there any other elected officials here that I missed? Oh, Kathy Kipp, is that? And David Trout and Kathy Kipp from the PSD School Board. Welcome. So I wanted to briefly just say a few words about the Fort Collins Air Quality Advisory Board. They're a board convened by City Council to provide recommendations to City Council, and they have been considering the issue of the Martin Marietta asphalt plant for several months now. They have had this discussion be a topic at one of their regular meetings. They have formed a subcommittee to provide comments for the city to the City Council on the air permit, and they also participated in the listening session that was held not too long ago. And so following tonight's joint meeting, the Air Quality Board will this joint meeting will adjourn, and the Air Quality Board will reconvene their regularly scheduled meeting for tonight, and they'll be meeting down the hall in Conference Room 1B, starting at 7:35. And so with that, I would like to, before I turn it over to Doug Ryan, who is the Larimer County Environmental Advisory Board staff liaison, I'd like to ask Councilmember Cuniff if there are any words that you'd like to say. And I would also like to just mention for everyone, for all the board members, because this is being televised, in order for your words to be recorded, please use the microphones, and to activate the microphone, you just push the button in the center and a green light comes on. Then you're live, and then when you're through speaking, press the button again and it will go off. So Councilmember Cuniff.
Thanks, Lucinda, and thanks for everybody for being here, for the members of the two boards, for the members of the public, for the people from the company who are here, and others. It's certainly been a lot of discussion that we've had about the asphalt plant there on the Poudre River, and some questions and concerns have come up. This is an important step in the process. Essentially what these two boards are going to do is convene jointly and then individually and make recommendations to their governing bodies, to the City Council in our case, or to the Board of County Commissioners, who will then potentially weigh in as governmental entities to the state's draft plan comment period. I want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, although this is a meeting being held in public, it is not a public forum. So we will be having 5 minutes total for everybody to speak in front of this joint assembly. There are other opportunities for members of the public who wish to speak about this issue. There is going to be a City Council meeting tomorrow night where we'll have public comment on non-agenda topics, as well as the September 2nd City Council meeting. I believe this will be on the agenda at that time. You'll have the chance to speak before us on that agenda topic, as well as I'm given to understand the Board of County Commissioners has a regular public comment period before their weekly Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. you said? But most importantly, you certainly have the opportunity to weigh in on the draft plan itself at the state level. And I think we all encourage you to take that avenue as well, express your questions and concerns so that the state regulatory agency who is tasked with actually issuing this permit can do their job. So my role here actually is as an observer. As Lucinda said, I am the liaison, but really we want the board to develop its opinion independently and give its recommendations to council, and I'm sure the county commissioners have the same feelings. So again, just thanks for being here. I certainly ask that everybody be respectful of the dialogue and the ground rules, but I do hope that we can have some excellent information shared and have people clear at least on what the next steps are going to be.
Thank you. So now I'd like to turn it over to Doug Ryan. He's the staff liaison for the Larimer County Environmental Science and Advisory Board and is with the Larimer County Department of Public Health.
Thank you, Lucinda. The county commissioners, I think, have heard the citizens' concerns about this issue sort of loud and clear, and they charged the Environmental and Science Advisory Board with reviewing the draft permit when it comes out, and with providing comments for their consideration to forward to the State Health Department. We've had a couple of background meetings on this where we've looked at the current permit and the state's air emissions permitting process. We've talked about the difference between a mobile source and a stationary source permit, and we've talked about the asphalt process. So we see this tonight as an opportunity to review our consultant's report, and that consultant was hired jointly by the city and the county to help our boards understand the technical nature of these reports. These reports involve air dispersion modeling and some very complicated emissions inventories, and I think it's fair to say that both boards felt like they could gain value by having a technical consultant's report to help them review that. Tonight, for the Environmental Advisory Board, we see this as an information session for our board. No formal action will be taken by the county's board. And then a week from tomorrow, on August 26th, the Environmental and Science Advisory Board will meet back over at 200 West Oak to develop their formal comments for forwarding to the county commissioners. And then for the county, on September 2nd, which is a Tuesday at 9 in the morning, that's when we'll plan to present our formal comments to the county commissioners for their consideration, and that's called their Administrative Matters meeting. Lucinda?
Thank you, Doug. So now I'd like to turn it over to Tom Moore. He's the chair of the Fort Collins Air Quality Advisory Board and will be facilitating this meeting.
Okay, well, good evening and welcome, everyone. Appreciate all the introductory comments. So the job that I have tonight is to kind of run the meeting. Michael Jones, the chair of the county board, has agreed to have me do that, so I'll do that as best I can. First of all, I'd like to briefly review the agenda. We're going to have the 5-minute comment period that Councilman Kniff mentioned, and then we're going to turn quickly to the presentation by Mr. Gebhardt on his analysis of the draft air permit and his recommendations. And then by 7, we want to move to a question and answer session and let members of both boards have a chance to ask questions and understand his analysis better. And then the goal is to adjourn by 7:30. So it's definitely a pleasure to be meeting with the ESAB, and I would request that you all introduce yourself so that everyone in the room can hear you, and then we'll come back to the Fort Collins board and let folks introduce ourselves here. You will need to turn on the microphone in order to be heard over the taping, so please do that.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Karish. Cassie Archuleta.
Jeremy Duto.
Michael Jones, Chair of the ESAB.
Richard Alper.
Evelyn King.
Ryan McShane.
Joe Wilson.
Lou Gator, County Commissioner.
Steve Johnson, County Commissioner.
Ross Kniff.
Doug Ryan, Larimer County.
Greg Miller.
Tom Griggs.
Rich Fisher.
Jim Dennison. I'm Howard Gebhardt. I'm the consultant.
Okay, great. Any members of either board have any questions about the agenda tonight? Ready to get started? Okay, great. Well, the first thing we're going to do is ask for public comments. If you'd like to make a public comment, could you please raise your hand so I can have a count? Okay, I see 2. So why don't you each take about 2.5 minutes. You need to give your name, and you'll need to use the microphone.
Good evening, Commissioners, Councillor, Board members, and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kevin Pass. I'm with Citizens Against Asphalt Toxins and trying to represent the citizens in the area around the asphalt plant. First of all, if I may pose a question to the board members, do any of the board members know the safe dose of benzene for a 12-year-old? No? Well, neither do I. But in 1948, the American Petroleum Institute stated it's 0 for adults. If we take toluene, we take all the other VOCs coming off that plant, we don't know what's going to happen. Basically, the industry works from the basis that we're safe, you've got to prove we're unsafe. We've seen that before with the tobacco industry. When they first brought cigarettes out, they said they were safe, they're going to help your lung capacity. Seems quite quaint now. It took years for us to determine that tobacco was unsafe. In that time, many people died, many people had illnesses. You saw the same thing with lead in petrol. It was 1930s. We knew lead was dangerous in petrol. We didn't get it out of fuel until the 1970s. Now, would it take 30 years of emissions from this plant spreading onto Lincoln Middle School to prove that it's not safe for those children? The Air Quality Board have a chance to draw a line in the sand and put some preventive measures in. We all understand this permit is likely to be issued. If it is issued, we need some protections. All around that plant, we should have CO2 monitors just around the perimeter of the plant. We should have VOC monitors on Lincoln Middle School. Many of you may not be aware, but at the moment, the teachers go out at recess and smell the air. And if the air doesn't smell bad, they let the children out. Now, you might think, well, kids aren't there in the summer, but the school is used year-round by the Boys and Girls Club. That is not a very safe way of protecting the children. That's very 19th century, not 21st century. So if we look at the production levels of the plant, if it was over 500,000, it would be a major producer, subjected to many more regulations. They've said they'll stick to 475. Now, the history of large American corporations keeping their word is not a great one, quite frankly. However, even at 475, in the last 3 months, the third quarter, which is June, July, August, they produce 190,000 tonnes. If that carried on all year round...
Mr. Bass, could you wrap up there,
Yes,
please?
I will. That would be 760,000 tonnes, which would make them well over a major producer. So for at least 3 months of the year, they are a major producer. So let's look at some good safety measures. We can't trust them. They weren't inspected for 10 years. We've got to have it inspected by the county every single month. Spot checks to make sure they're sticking to their word, and also monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Prusnick, District 3 citizen of Fort Collins. I just want to say that sometimes the government tells us something is safe and it's dangerous. Sometimes they tell us it's dangerous and it turns out to be safe. This is definitely a very complicated issue. The boards here with the experts need a consultant to help them understand the issue. And one of the most important jobs of the government is to protect and promote the general welfare of the people. So the question becomes, at what point do we trust the data? What point do we trust the smell? Do we err on safety? Can you explain that this plan is safe in a way that the standard citizen can understand and be truthful about it, or not? So I'd like you to think about those things as you go through your process, and remember, if the regulations don't allow us to stop this process, our elected officials can vote with their power of their purse to not buy asphalt from this plant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, any more requests for public comment? Okay, great. I'm going to close the public comment period, and we're going to move to the presentation now. I've had the pleasure of knowing Howard Gebhardt for several years, and think a lot of air resource specialist, and I'm very pleased that he's here tonight to brief us on his analysis of the draft permit. So Howard, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I will need to probably log
I will warn people in the room who haven't been in here before that this has a funny light system, so don't be surprised if the lights suddenly go out. We'll get them back on. So.
Mary Pat? Where's Mary Pat? All the files are loaded on her computer. So if you don't mind, we'll just take a minute and get this sorted out. So I just want to, other user. So you need to log in again because they're loaded up for you. Sorry about that.
Go back to the beginning here. So how do I go back to the first slide?
So you can just do, excuse me, a page down.
Okay. Or go this way.
Sorry, yeah. And this is your
Okay,
microphone.
thank you. So first, I'd like to thank members of the two boards, elected officials from the city and the county and the Poudre School District, and members of the general public who have elected to come here tonight to hear my presentation. We're going to basically do a technical review of the draft permit that's proposed to be issued to Martin Marietta Materials for their asphalt plant. My contact information is there on the slides. I've also left a whole handful of cards on the table where you signed in, and if those ran out and you still want one, I have others with me and can provide those to you later in the presentation. So a brief overview of what ARS was hired to do. I've described it as a review of the review. The State Air Pollution Control Division has conducted a review of the application materials that Martin Marietta Materials submitted in support of their desire to have their air permit. And basically, I'm reviewing those materials that the state has provided that support the review that the state did and support the draft permit. My analysis is really limited to those issues that are associated with the air permit itself. I know that the public, the general public, has concerns about the plant. Some of those concerns are within the context of the air permit. Some of those are not. I'm only addressing those issues that are really within the context of the air permit. The bullets on this slide provide a brief summary of the work scope that I performed. I reviewed the draft permit and the permit conditions as provided by the state of Colorado. I looked at the air emissions inventory that supported the draft permit, as well as reviewing the dispersion modeling that was supporting of the draft permit. Now, something that the city and county asked me to do that is outside the context of the permit itself and is not specifically regulated by the Colorado is, whoops, I was leaning against the table and advanced the slides accidentally. Anyway, the assessment of potential public health impacts of hazardous air pollutants is actually outside the context of the state air permit. The state air permit does not specifically regulate concentrations of hazardous air pollutants in the ambient air in the state of Colorado, but both boards had asked me to look at that, and so I've done that by basically extrapolating from the state's modeling analysis that they did for carbon monoxide, and we'll get into the details of how that was done as part of the presentation. The findings have been summarized in a technical report. That technical report was released in draft form on Friday. It's still a draft document. It may be revised based on comments and suggestions I get from the boards tonight. And then I'm presenting the findings to a meeting of both boards, and that's what I'm doing here today. I think everybody in the room kind of knows where this is, but I just thought I'd lay out in context. The star is the location of the asphalt plant. I'm going to step away from the mic. You want me to use this? Thank you. Yeah. So we have the location of the asphalt plant that's marked by the star. The parking lot and the access to the Poudre River Trail is there. The closest residents are actually, there's one here, one over there that's near the Poudre River Trailhead. Many of the people in the public live back in this area along Stonecrest Drive. And then we have the Lincoln Middle School that's, you can see in the bottom of the photograph to the right there. This is a schematic of the asphalt plant process itself. This was provided by the company. The liquid asphalt comes in and is stored in these storage tanks. Okay.
Could you use the mouse pointer, please?
So that would be just using this because that red one doesn't show up on
Okay. So the asphalt cement storage tanks are located there. That's where the liquid asphalt comes into the process. The aggregate materials come through these cold feed bins. It's fed to the silo, or fed to the kiln. They can also bring in what they call RAP, or recycled asphalt pavement, as a feedstock to the plant. The material is heated. The asphalt product is then transferred by conveyor belt to these storage silos that are here. The exhaust air goes through a bag house. A bag house is a fabric filter dust collector. It works very much like your vacuum cleaner at home. The dirty air goes through the bags, the particulate matter is captured in those bags, and the clean air is exhausted out. So consider, for people in the general public, this is the concepts of how a fabric filter bag house works is almost identical to the process that you see work in your day-to-day life on a vacuum cleaner. These bags are just a lot more efficient at capturing the particles, and they handle a much larger volume of air than your vacuum cleaner. So the bag house is one of the emission controls that is provided at the plant. There are two emission controls that the company has voluntarily adopted that are not listed in the air permit. One is that on the product conveyor, I'll just go back to here, which is the conveyor that runs from the kiln up to the product storage silos. On that conveyor belt, they have installed a point where they recycle and recapture some of the exhaust air that would otherwise leave the plant, and that exhaust air is routed back to the burner in the kiln for destruction of the VOCs that would be present in the air. And the other thing that they've done more recently is on the liquid asphalt plants, they've installed some condensers that those condensers take the vapors that would otherwise be emitted at those tanks, condense the product back to liquid form, and return the product back to the tanks. This is actually a picture that I took on one of my site visits to the plant, where you can see on the product conveyor the capture system that they've installed, and then the piping goes back over my head in view of the picture here and returns the air back to the kiln for control of VOCs that would otherwise go with the hot product that's being transferred up to the silo. So you imagine that I'm standing at the base of the conveyor belt, looking almost straight up here when I'm taking this picture. So these are the emissions for what we call the criteria pollutants that are in the air permit. PM is particulate matter. PM10 is particulate matter sized 10 microns and less, which is what the form of the regulated pollutant of particulate matter is. And PM 2.5 is for the size of 2.5 microns or less, and that is the size that is inhalable into the lungs. We have both stack emissions, which are the emissions that come from the baghouse stack, and fugitive emissions, which would be things like dust from the road truck traffic that runs for the trucks running in and out of the plant, and other kinds of outside storage material. So we have both stack and fugitive for particulate matter. For nitrogen oxides, which is NOx, sulfur dioxide, SO2, VOC is volatile organic compounds, CO is carbon monoxide. The pollutants listed in the permit are listed there. These are in units of tons per year, and they're representative of the emissions at the maximum throughput that's in the permit of 475,000 tons. For the NOx emissions, the SO2 emissions, and the VOC emissions, those numbers match what is in what us air pollution scientists call AP42, which is a document that the EPA has published that lists the expected emissions from all different types of emission source categories around the country. Asphalt batch plants is one of the categories that's covered. The NOx, SO2, and VOC emissions that are in the permit exactly match the AP42 EPA document. For particulate matter, and then by extrapolation the PM10 and PM2.5, the numbers are slightly different than the AP42 number. What the state has told me is that they have derived this number from the allowable emission standard in what is called the New Source Performance Standard. It's a federal regulation. All asphalt plants that are new or modified, built after a certain date, have to meet a certain emission standard, which is 0.04 grains per dry standard cubic foot of exhaust air from the baghouse stack. A grain is 1/7,000th of a pound. And so they're limited to 0.04 grains per cubic foot of air that goes out of the exhaust. That's a federal regulation, and what the state has told me, and I'm still waiting for the actual documentation of these calculations, but that the numbers for the particulate matter are based on that number. But I personally have not been able to confirm that yet because the state has not yet provided me the backup documentation that I requested, but I only requested it a couple days ago. For those numbers, though, even though they're based on the NSPS, are quite close to the AP42 standard. They're a little bit higher, and the exact details are listed in the technical, in the verbiage in the technical report. For carbon monoxide, this 72.2 tons is actually a number that is based on 0.4 pounds per ton of exhaust times the 475,000 tons. It's a number that the APCD has themselves derived. That number is higher than the AP42 emission factor. They have calculated emissions both for nitrogen, for the natural gas, that is the primary fuel, and for LPG or propane, which is the emergency fuel that the plant can use. The number for the propane at 0.4 is more than twice the AP42 value. The AP42 value is 0.13 pounds per ton, and the permit limit is based on 0.4 pounds per ton. The state has told me in my conversations with them that based on their review of other permits and actual stack testing data for carbon monoxide emissions at asphalt batch plants, that they don't think the AP42 number is a valid number. They see numbers that are higher, and so that's why they've allowed a higher number in this permit. But we'll address that when we get a little more when we get to the specific comments that I have about the permit. The state has also quantified emissions for hazardous air pollutants for 7 different pollutants here: acetaldehyde, formaldehyde, toluene, benzene, ethylbenzene, quinone, and hydrogen chloride, or HCl. The benzene, ethylbenzene, and formaldehyde numbers, again, match the AP42 document exactly for an asphalt batch plant fired on natural gas. The toluene number that the state has relied on is actually the AP42 number for fuel oil, which is significantly higher than the number for natural gas by more than an order of magnitude. So that's how they get the 1378. The real number, if they were to apply the correct factor, would be lower by more than an order of magnitude. It would be more like 100 pounds a year instead of 1,300 pounds a year. So I think they took the wrong number from the wrong table and applied it in the permit, and that'll be part of the comments that we address. So I asked them also to provide the documentation for where they got the acetaldehyde, quinone, and HCl numbers. And the interesting answer I got back is that those numbers were included in the permit by mistake. So my expectation is that the state will actually, when they issue the final permit, will not include those numbers in the final document, because those numbers are not, there are no numbers in AP42 for acetaldehyde, quinone, and HCl. There's no, so I don't know where they got the information, where they got those numbers from, but from everything I can tell, there's no documentation of what those emissions would be if there are any. There are two pollutants that I think they omitted from the analysis that are in the AP42 document, both hexane and xylene. Those numbers would be comparable to the benzene and ethylbenzene numbers in terms of what their emission factors are. So if they were included, it would be on the order of 100 or so pounds per year for those pollutants. But again, those pollutants, so it looks like they included numbers and pollutants that they probably had no business including, but they omitted some others. And so that'll be part of the technical comments when we get to that part of the report. For modeling, the state modeled the carbon monoxide emissions, and that is based on the magnitude of the emissions and the criteria that the state uses to judge which emissions get modeled. Depending on the magnitude of a particular pollutant, if the emissions are over a certain threshold, they get modeled. The carbon monoxide emissions exceeded that threshold, so they got modeled. And they use what is called the air screen model, which is an EPA, air quality dispersion model. It's a very simplistic model. It's a conservative first cut prediction, and the version number is listed there. It means the model, the version of this model that was used came out in 2011 on Julian Day 126. For the CO emissions, they did model the emissions at 160 pounds per hour. So if you take 400 tons per hour, which is what is on the application form submitted by the company as the maximum short-term capacity of the plant, and you take the maximum 0.4 pounds per ton, that's where you get it. You just multiply 0.4 times 400, you get 160. So it's very straightforward, but they've modeled the absolute maximum CO emission rate that could be emitted by the plant in a 1 hour condition based on the allowable permit limit that has been proposed. To take the air screen result for a 1 hour number and convert it to the 8 hour number for comparison to the standard for carbon monoxide, the approach is to simply take the 1 hour number times the scaling factor of 0.9, and that's how they get the 8 hour concentration. The concentration is then added to a background concentration, which comes from the Fort Collins carbon monoxide monitor, which is located at approximately Mason and Laurel Streets on the Colorado State University campus, a location that has significantly more traffic and other things, and you would expect that that carbon monoxide background from that monitor is probably significantly higher than what really occurs out of North Taft Hill Road. The other thing that's included in the modeling is what we call building downwash, or it's the effect of buildings on the turbulence and dispersion in the atmosphere. And they've considered 3 different buildings: the lime silo, the asphalt storage silos, and the baghouse structure itself. And we'll talk about this a little more in details. We have some photos of that. But this air screen model, because of its simplicity, you can only run one building at a time. So So they ran the lime silo building and looked at its results. They looked at the asphalt storage silo analysis and looked at its results. They took the bag house structure and looked at its results, and then they took the worst case of those three to determine what the actual concentration of carbon monoxide was from the model. So this is an actual picture of the plant. It's from the APCD modeling report. Here are the liquid storage tanks. Here's the kiln. The bag house stack is approximately right there. The lime silo is this, it's a relatively tall structure. It's relatively small in diameter, but you can see it's very close to the bag house source. The taller structures, which are the tallest structures on the plant, are the asphalt storage silos. They're over here. They're somewhat farther away from the stack. So because of their distance away, they'll probably have less pronounced effect when it comes to the turbulence and dispersion. And then the bag house structure itself is in the blue outline right here. And so those are the three buildings and then the location in relation to the stack. And so they run the model with this stack and this building. Then they run the model with this stack and this building. They run the model with this stack and the building that's the bag house structure itself. And then they looked at the worst case result from those three scenarios. So this is what we get. So the 1 hour average concentration, what comes right out of the model. Actually, when the state did the model, they modeled what I call a unit emission rate. They modeled a 1.0 gram per second emission rate, and then you apply you multiply the answer that's in the model by the difference in the emissions divided by 1, or the difference in the emissions, and you get the air screen concentration. So you can see that depending on which building is the dominant building for a particular scenario, you get a significantly different answer. And so the worst case result occurs with our lime silo. So going backwards again, so the lime silo where they're adding lime right to the kiln, it's because of its proximity to the stack, that building has a much more significant influence on the airflow around the structure than these taller sources here, because of the distance and the proximity of the two. And that's what the modeling tells us. So we have the air screen concentration. We add the background for the 1 hour number. The background is a significant contributor. It's almost the same order of magnitude as the impact itself. But even for a 1 hour concentration, the standard is 40,000 micrograms per cubic meter, which is equivalent to 35 parts per million. But the prediction from the model is only 12,953. It's significantly below what that standard is. For the 8 hour number, the 8 hour, again, all you do is you take the 1 hour number here times 0.9, and you get this number down here. You add the background, because it's now the 8 hour average background, it has a different value than the 1 hour average background that we had before. For the lime silo, the concentration is just below the standard. It's 9933 versus a standard of 10,000 micrograms per cubic meter, which is, on a parts per million basis, I believe is 9 parts per million. For the other two combinations, there's a much greater margin of safety. So in order to understand whether or not this is a realistic result, what we really have to do is look at and see whether or not the combination that provides the lime silo is really a realistic combination that would happen in real life. So the conservatisms that are in the model, one of them is the building configuration. Now I'll go back to the picture here. So because of the way where the lime silo is and where the stack is, when the winds come either from the north or from the south is when the lime silo has an effect on the winds in reality. When the winds are coming from the east and the west, the lime silo is kind of to the side, and it's not going to have an effect on the winds and the turbulence and dispersion under those conditions. But in the model, what they've done is they've said, well, the closest receptor is over here on the property boundary at 87 meters away. It's directly to the west of where the stack is. So in reality, the worst case result that comes out of the model, with the lime silo as being the dominant building, is really a condition that probably doesn't really occur in real life. The worst case result, they say, actually occurs with a wind with a flow of up to 300 degrees, which would put the receptor somewhere up here. That distance is slightly greater than the 87 meters that it would be here. It's more like 100 meters. And when you look at the modeling result for up here at 100 meters, it's about 10% lower than it was for the 87 meter receptor in the worst case location. So that building configuration introduces conservatism, meaning that the model is over predicting what is probably really happening in the real world. Additional conservatism is based on our 0.9 scaling factor. What this really means is that the 8-hour concentration is 90% of the 1-hour concentration. For that to occur, the worst case condition that the 1-hour model represents basically has to persist for 8 hours. The emissions have to be at the maximum rate, which is running at the 400 tons per hour on propane. The meteorology condition that produces the worst case condition has to repeat itself for 8 hours. So those are all very unlikely occurrences in my view. And so there's a lot of margin that is introduced if you were to look at a more realistic scenario of how the 8-hour and 1-hour average, what that relationship would be. As I've mentioned before, the emissions are also different under propane versus normal firing, which is on natural gas. The natural gas number is 0.291 pounds per ton versus 0.4, so that's about a 25% safety factor introduced at that point. And then the CO background is also, because it comes from the city of Fort Collins, downtown monitoring site where there's a lot of traffic. Keep going the wrong way. You can see the background, even for the worst case result, is probably a third of the total. And so if this number is higher than it would really be in real life, then there's additional margin of safety. So even though the modeling shows that the compliance margin is right up against the standard, because of the conservatisms that are inherent in the modeling, I'm highly confident that the CO numbers are going to be significantly below the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, based on the conservative assumptions that overstate the impacts that's inherent and part of the modeling study. So I'd like to talk a little bit too about our HAP modeling analysis. As I said before, it was extrapolated from the carbon monoxide modeling data that the state did. I've looked at 3 receptors to do that analysis. There's a residence right next to the trailhead parking lot that is immediately south of the facility. I looked at a residence on Stonecrest Drive. When I looked at the Google Earth images, the third house in from Taft Hill Road is actually, that property is the closest property on that street to the Bag House stack. And so that's the location I analyzed. And the third location I analyzed was the Lincoln Middle School. So the residence near the trailhead is at a distance of 239 meters from the Bag House stack at a direction of 160 degrees. The Stonecrest Drive is at a distance of 632 meters at a direction of 194 degrees. And Lincoln Middle School is 1,130 meters away as measured to the northwest corner of the school building at a direction of 155.6 degrees. Now, when I looked at then for this distance and this azimuth, I was able to then determine what the worst case result in the APCD modeling from the air screen output is, and that's shown here. And that is then the number that I'll scale the emission rate by when I do the analysis for each individual pollutant. So if I'm going to do the assessment of hazardous air pollutants, I need some threshold to compare the results of the answer to the model to. And this is the document that I've relied on to determine what I'm going to call as the safe concentration. I will say that I am not a toxicologist, and so I am simply relying on the data in the EPA document to make this determination. I am not qualified to make a judgment as to whether the EPA concentrations are or are not the appropriate values. But I have to have something to compare the model results to, and I've relied on, this is the document that I've relied on, and there's more information in the actual report. So we've looked at both acute impacts and chronic impacts, and acute impacts are short-term impacts. So it's whether or not a short-term exposure to the pollutant will cause any kind of health effects. So the way it works is that you take the air screen concentration, which is in micrograms per cubic meter, and that's the concentration for the state has modeled the unit emission rate of 1 gram per second for. So to get the concentration for the other pollutants, you simply take the concentration for that receptor times the emission rate in grams per second for that pollutant. And you get the answer for each receptor for that pollutant. And so for acute impacts, the concentrations are, the formaldehyde is the one that it comes closest, but even it is well below the emission safe concentration threshold. In the EPA report, most of the acute safe concentration thresholds come from what is called the California reference exposure level. And that is, California has decreed that concentration as a concentration below which no adverse health effects will occur. So on an acute exposure level, these numbers are way, way below what I've decreed as the safe concentration level. And formaldehyde is the only one that is anywhere close. And even at the closest residence, it's almost a factor of 2 below the safe level. And at the school, it's significantly below by greater than an order of magnitude, even for the worst case pollutant. We've also looked at chronic impacts, and that should actually say the calculated annual average HAP exposure, not the 1 hour average exposure. My apologies for that. The 1 hour exposure, the annual average exposures does the same way. The emission rate times the air screen concentration, and then to convert the 1 hour to an annual average exposure, the factor it's used is 0.1. So if you carry through those analyses, again, you see that the concentrations predicted are below the safe concentration thresholds. For the safe concentration thresholds for those that are marked as carcinogenic HAPs, which means that they can cause cancer, the safe concentration is based on the EPA unit risk factor for a excess cancer risk of 1 in 1 million. So if the standard is, if this number for acetaldehyde is roughly 1/10 of the safe concentration threshold, that would mean that at that location, over a 70-year lifetime of exposure to that pollutant level, the excess cancer risk would be approximately 1 in 10 million. So for those ones that are marked in the asterisk, that's the 1 in a million excess cancer risk threshold based on the EPA unit risk factors that come from the document that I cited earlier. In the document, there is no listed concentration for the quinone, so that's not listed here. For the toluene and hydrogen chloride, there is a chronic exposure threshold listed in the EPA document, and that what was used for this analysis. Oh, what did I do?
You can just go back
Go back to slideshow.
from current slide. Is that where you want to be?
Well, that's kind of at the beginning, but we'll just page through. So lastly, I'd like to get to some specific comments about the draft permit itself. And we'll go through these. These are also probably in more detail within the report. The first one we talked about a little bit is the HAP emissions. There's an error in the toluene emissions by more than an order of magnitude that the emissions appear to be overstated. There's also certain HAPs that are not been included in the state's analysis, and so my recommendation to each board is they would make a comment about that, and a more detailed language for the comments are all in the report. A general comment I have is that the permit lacks consideration of other sources owned and operated by Martin Marietta Materials in the vicinity. It only includes an assessment of the asphalt plant, does not include an assessment of the aggregate mining and processing operations that occur across the street to the west. In order for it to be a complete and accurate assessment, they need to have a consideration of those emissions and whether or not those emissions would then cause the source to be regulated as a major source instead of its current minor source. I think it's unlikely that when the state does that it will change the conclusion, but in order to be a true and accurate assessment of the source, it needs to have that, and it should be done. Another comment I have is that there's a condition in the permit that requires an operating and maintenance plan, and Martin Marietta will submit that to the state, and the state will review and approve it, and that plan will contain more details that are in that that are in the permit about how Martin Marietta will operate its facility to stay in compliance with the permit. That traditionally occurs outside the purview of the public and is a negotiated thing between the applicant, in this case Martin Marietta, and the state APCD. I don't know if the state would open up that to a more public process, but that would be one of the suggestions that I'm making to the boards to consider, that they request that they be allowed to participate and make that a more public process than it currently is. Another comment is about the control equipment. We've mentioned in our previous discussion that Martin Marietta has voluntarily included additional controls not required under its permit. I think it would be appropriate, though, for those emission controls to be made legally enforceable requirements of the permit, and that's one of the suggested comments. Part of that is due to the fact that the legal obligation for an air permit is that emissions in the ozone non-attainment area that Fort Collins is in be reasonably available control technology. And if the company is already doing it, then it makes sense to me that it's already been documented that it's a reasonably available control. And therefore, even though the state's permit analysis said that no additional control constituted RACT, I would find otherwise, in that the controls that the company has committed to in terms of the recycle from the asphalt conveyor and the condensers on the liquid asphalt storage tanks, if the company is doing it, in my view, it's already proven to be RACT and should be required as such in the permit. The permit includes emissions testing requirements, but it's not specific that those requirements be applied to both the natural gas fuel, which is the primary fuel, and the propane. And so I would suggest that the permit be explicit and require that that testing be conducted on both fuels. And then the last is about the HAP emissions testing. All of my extrapolations from the state on the modeling about HAPs is dependent on the accuracy of the emissions data that is from the AP42 and other documents. And so I'm going to suggest that the emissions testing include quantification of at least some of the HAPs so that we can demonstrate whether or not the emissions data that we're relying on for this health assessment do indeed come true. And that's the end of the presentation, and so I'll be happy to address questions from the board.
Okay, great. Thank you, Howard. That was a very nice overview. So let me start with the Environmental Science Board. Any questions from you all to start off with?
I have two questions, Howard. The initial question is, why does CDPHE use AirScreen instead of AirMod?
Well, AirScreen is a more simplistic version of AirMod. In essence, AirScreen runs through a scenario of, for all intents and purposes, all possible meteorological dispersion conditions, and then from it takes the worst case analysis. In order to run AirMod accurately, you have to have a representative meteorological data set. So whether or not such a data set exists, I don't know. That could have been part of the reason they chose to do AirScreen. A lot of times you start with AirScreen. If AirScreen shows that there is an adverse impact, you might then go to the next step and run the AirMod model. But in this case, the AirScreen analysis by itself showed compliance. And the state really doesn't care how much it shows compliance by. If it was 99.99, it would pass. It's a pass-fail test.
Right.
We're not being graded ABC here. It's a pass-fail course in terms of air dispersion modeling. So that would be a question probably better posed to the state. I'm kind of speculating. But if the AirScreen analysis shows compliance, it's usually a more conservative tool. It's a simpler tool. You don't have to have as much data. You don't have to have representative meteorological data. If it passes, then oftentimes that's what they'll stick by.
Okay, thanks. You answered my second question, too.
Other questions?
Yeah, I guess I would like to ask one. Out of all of the conditions that you have, what would be the most important one? And maybe can you add a little bit as far as value added to the permit and actually putting those conditions into the permit?
Right. To me, the ones that are most important would be to make the voluntary emission controls that the company has committed to as legally enforceable requirements. And the second one would be to make sure that the testing is done for both sets of fuels that the company wants to employ. Those would be the most critical, those would add the most value and be most protective of public health based on the comments that I've provided.
Is it okay to legally for the state to consider other MMM sources to the west under this permit for this site?
I believe it is. The definition of a source is based on three things: whether or not the source is under the same standard industrial classification code, whether or not is on what is called contiguous or adjacent properties. It is clearly on contiguous and adjacent properties. And the third one is whether or not it's under common control of a single entity, and it clearly is in this case. An asphalt batch plant is a separate SIC code from the other operations. But in this case, a lot of the aggregate materials used at the asphalt plant, my understanding is, come from the processing operation across the street. So that makes it what is called a support facility in the EPA and CDPHE regulatory process. And when you have a support facility, then the SIC code criteria goes away. And so we are on contiguous or adjacent properties owned by the same company. In my view, they have to consider everything together. I don't think it's going to change the conclusion, but I want him to do it. I want the state to do it right.
And one more now. This report called preliminary risk-based screening that you relied on, do you know whether it's the most recent or how old it is?
It's in the, I believe it's a 2010 report, but some of the tables have been updated. I've used the most recent EPA tables, which are as recent as 2012 in some cases. And I think when I do the final report, I was intending to include that document in the tables as well as an appendix, and probably just put all of that on a CD that would go with the report.
I have another one for you. In your professional opinion, do you have some idea of what the amount of difference might be between the CO monitor at Laurel and Mason versus the area where the MMM plant is?
Well, I have not looked in detail at how the state derived the number. That number is 3 parts per million, 4 parts per million, somewhere in that range. I think that that's probably pretty high, particularly for a rural area, a somewhat rural location. There's not a lot of traffic out there. CO is a traffic-driven pollutant. You're a block away from College Avenue. With the way that with where the monitor is now, there's a lot more traffic at that location than there is on North Taft Hill Road. So I think that monitor is probably significantly, but I don't know that I could give you a quantitative estimate. It would take a little more evaluation of the actual data and things like that. But I would concur with the state's assessment that that's a conservative estimate of the true background for the site it's being applied for.
I have another question. Based on the data that we have with the safe concentrations, if we did not implement any of the additional conditions, would you expect any change to your explanation of the health impact?
Well, the most important thing with respect to my determination of HAPs is whether or not my estimate of the emission rate is correct. And that can only be determined if there's an emissions test that would quantify the emissions of the hazardous air pollutants. That is not currently a requirement of the permit. Whether or not the state would include that is, I don't know, because it's not something the state would typically regulate. The state doesn't have anything under its regulatory authority to compare a number to. So they may not be comfortable doing testing for emissions and then they have nothing to compare the answer to. So it could be something that could be worked out between the board and Martin Marietta on a more voluntary basis as opposed to requiring it in the permit, because there really isn't any legal obligation that the state would have to require that.
Any questions from the Fort Collins board?
Howard, what about upset conditions? Are they typically considered in asphalt batch plans?
Typically, upset conditions are exempted from compliance from regulations in most cases. So if there was a process upset and it was properly reported according to the Colorado air quality regulations, the emissions could be higher for that short-term event, and it would not be a violation of the permit.
And do you have, once again, by experience, what is the duration of a short-term period upset that's permitted by APCD?
Well, I think if there was an upset, the plant has an obligation to try to mitigate what it would, so they could shut down the process or things like that. I think it's kind of speculative because things like power failures are likely causes of process upsets. A power failure here probably shuts down their process more as much as it would shut down the pollution control equipment. Process upsets tend to be more important where there's a lot of pollution control systems that would go offline and the process would stay online. Here, the only control is really the bag house, which is a particulate control device. The particulate emissions are kind of low. I'm sort of having a hard time visualizing what kind of process upset might lead to large-scale CO. You know, as I say, a power failure is a typical thing that would cause a process upset. My guess is that a power failure probably closes down their plant. They might have a very short-term excursion of CO above that limit, but I wouldn't expect it to last very long.
I have one for you, a couple for you, Howard. So I noticed you didn't include a background term on the HAP. Is there any professional approach to doing that?
Well, one, I don't know that I have any data to make such an assessment. My view is that the background levels are likely to be very low. And in most cases, I was already below the standard by a very, very large margin of safety, so I'm not sure that including a background would have changed the conclusion significantly.
And then a second question, is there anything in your analysis that would lead you to believe that, I think one of the conservatisms is that the plant runs full capacity all the time?
Right. In the CO modeling, it's based on the 400 ton per hour maximum capacity rate. So the 160 pounds per hour is the maximum CO emissions at that rate. When we look at an 8-hour average, then they would have to emit, for the model result to be correct, they'd have to emit the 160 pounds per hour for that whole 8 hours. So that means that they're running at the 400 ton per hour rate continuously for that day. They're also running on propane for that day. And then the other conservatisms with the persistence of the worst case meteorology and other things like that. So I just think that there's enough conservatism when you have to, for the worst case thing to be for 8 hours in a row, all of the worst case assumptions to be persisting for 8 hours in a row. I think that'd be a very unlikely event.
And if there were any less production or cycling and production levels, you wouldn't expect to see any increases in emissions?
The emissions would be lower than what was in the
Everything
model
would scale
if they
down.
were, yeah, because the emissions are pounds per ton. So if they were running on natural gas for part of that time, then the emissions would be 25% lower, even if they were still at 400 tons per hour. I just think that the way that the analysis was done provides a lot of conservatism, and such that, in my view, that it's very unlikely you would have the conditions occur that would lead to 9,900 plus micrograms per cubic meter.
Howard, let's talk about fugitive emissions. And so with AirScreen, it's a point source model. So you're going to lump all the point source emissions and the fugitive emissions into one point source, right?
Correct, but remember, the state only models CO. There are no CO fugitives.
Okay, so.
And so the only fugitives in the state's analysis are for particulate. That was not a pollutant that was modeled.
Okay. When we talk about, I think just for a point of, I guess, clarification with regard to fugitive emissions versus point emissions, it's kind of interesting to talk about. In the real world, we have the stack emissions, which principally are the CO emissions, right? But then there are the toxic.
When we were back at the table, I'll go back to that table on the slides.
You're right, and so where I'm going with this, Howard, is so when we talk about where the fugitive emissions actually come from, they're not, obviously by definition, all going to come out of the stack. They're going to come from other places.
Right.
From
So in this table, where it says stack, then all of those emissions are from the baghouse stack. The fugitive emissions are only the particulate matter, and those, I think, are primarily truck traffic, so fugitive dust from trucks entering and leaving the property would also include any aggregate storage, outside storage of materials that might, loading and unloading of those piles, wind erosion, things like that. Those emissions tend to be close to the ground, and I think your point maybe is that the emissions, when they're fugitive emissions, they tend to have a predominantly higher ambient air impact than a stack emission. And that's probably a true statement. This stack is fairly low. It's 20 to 30 feet tall. It's affected by nearby buildings, so the stack emissions in the model are not actually that high above the ground either.
Yeah, and so the impact points for the fugitive emissions are likely different than the stack emissions, so.
That's also true.
Yeah, so to specify where the high concentrations occur really is not specifically addressed with this kind of analysis. Although it does satisfy, it does satisfy the APCD requirements for issuing a permit.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't say that the location of the maximum impact for particulate matter is the same as what you would have for CO. But for NOx, SO2, VOCs usually isn't a pollutant that's modeled directly anyway, but the impacts of those other pollutants from the baghouse stack should be the same as where the CO impact occurs.
Right. And then just to take it a little further, if we want to talk about the HAPs, and where their maximum impact is going to occur. Once again, not that we're necessarily focusing on the stack in that particular application, but they're going to occur in various locations. And if the source is well controlled, a lot of those are going to be as a result of mobile emissions off of the trucks as they leave.
Yeah. In my analysis, I have only considered the HAP emissions coming from the baghouse stack. I have not addressed the state of Colorado regulations for stationary sources do not include the effect of mobile sources. So the truck traffic emissions, other than the fugitive dust from the truck traffic, is not regulated in the stationary source permit program in the state of Colorado, nor is it regulated virtually anywhere else.
Right, but I just wanted to highlight that point so that if one were concerned about the impact of hazardous air pollution, this is a bit of a different animal than what we're talking about here.
Right. This analysis does only address the baghouse stack itself, and does not address hazardous air pollutants that might be emitted by emissions from vehicles entering and leaving the property.
Other questions? Good.
One question I had was, can everybody hear me in the back? I don't quite understand how on the HAP modeling, how you get from the acute to the chronic. Can you help me understand the calculation goes from, for example, the benzene goes from 4.6 micrograms per cubic meter for the 1 hour average HAP exposure for the residents, and then it's something like 100-fold lower for the chronic impact.
So there's really two things going on here. One is that for the acute exposure, the emission rate that's in the far left-hand column is the emission rate for the 400 ton per hour operation.
Okay.
In the chronic impact, because we're doing an annual average, that emission rate is based on the 475,000 tons per year. So there's a lower emission rate applied, because what we've done is we've taken the emission rate and averaged it over that longer annual 1 year period, and that annual period emission rate is capped by the permit because they simply cannot run the plant full-time 87, 60 hours per year at 400 tons per hour and comply with their permit. The other factor is we're similar to the way we adjusted the 1 hour to the 8 hour. There's an adjustment to go from the 1 hour to the annual. and that's a factor of 0.1 or 10%. So those are the two differences in the chronic, between the chronic modeling and the acute modeling. One, it's got a lower emission rate representing the long-term average emission rate of the plant. And the second is that we've assumed that the annual average concentration is 10% of the peak 1 hour, which probably is similar to because the 8-hour average is conservative. That's also probably a very conservative assessment.
Okay, I think I get that. Another question I had was, do you think that background formaldehyde under the acute scenario is liable to be negligible with respect to or in comparison to the levels that you've modeled here?
My guess is that formaldehyde is a kind of an urban pollutant. It's formed fuel combustion, and even people driving their cars up and down the street. As I say, I really don't have any data to go by to make an assessment as to what the background level could be.
I don't know if we might be able to try to look some up. Is it possible we might be able to at some point?
But I'm not sure what data exists. Are you just looking for a representative urban background, or are you actually asking about actual data?
Oh, no, representative. Some, just to get an idea of whether we're in the tens of micrograms or tenths of micrograms or whatever. I can Google it and see.
And I can do more work. I mean, this is why partly that my report to you guys at this point is a draft report, so I can take this kind of feedback and perhaps expand upon the report and address the concerns that the boards have expressed.
Another question I had was, in the regulatory context, if they had become a major source, over 500 tons source, I believe is the limit, how much more significant are the emissions controls relative to less than major source?
If it would be a major source subject to prevention of significant deterioration rules, and I'm not sure exactly what that production threshold would be. It's probably significantly higher. There are major sources under PSD, there are major sources under HAPs, there are major sources under operating permits. They're all different. The one that would have the most stringent controls would be if it was a major source subject to prevention of significant deterioration, or PSD. I do not believe that asphalt batch plants are listed source categories, so that would mean a 250 ton per year threshold, or 4 times higher than what the emission rate in the permit would be. If it had that requirement, it would be required to use best available control technology. Instead, the requirement is reasonably available control technology, which is a much less stringent emission standard.
Including in the context of the batch plants, asphalt batch plants.
Right. I mean, for asphalt batch plants, they would have to use if somebody else had it on somewhere else, anywhere in the country, they would have to apply it or demonstrate that it was not feasible or cost effective at this location.
I think I had another question in there. I'm not really very up on the regulatory requirements here, but I guess that's what you're here to help us with. And when the state issues this permit, or should they issue it, is there some basis under which they could require more controls, even if it's not a major source? Or is it either they get the permit or they don't get the permit, but there's no negotiation of control technology that will take place?
Well, in this permit, the legal requirement for the CO and VOC emissions is reasonably available control technology. That's because historically, Fort Collins is a CO non-attainment area, so it's called a maintenance area. And it's currently within the designated Front Range ozone non-attainment area. So a new or modified source within a maintenance area or non-attainment area for those pollutants needs to install reasonably available control technology that is the standard. It's a somewhat subjective standard. Somebody had asked about somewhere I have the definition of what reasonably available control technology actually is. So the definition of reasonably available control technology under the Colorado Common Provisions Regulation, and this is, I'm just going to read it. Technology that will achieve the maximum degree of emissions control that a particular source is capable of meeting that is reasonably available considering technological and economic feasibility. It may require technology that has been applied to similar but not necessarily identical source categories. It is not intended that extensive research and development be conducted before a given control technology can be applied to a source. This does not include or does not preclude requiring a short-term evaluation program to permit the application of a given technology to a particular type of source. So that's the regulatory definition in the Colorado regulations of what RACT is. In my view, if it's on the plant right now, it's demonstrated to be reasonably available considering technological and economic feasibility, and therefore meets RACT.
Well, then the follow-up question is, off the top of your head, are there other racks that are still reasonable that they don't have that should be thought about?
Well, and I've mentioned, this is covered in my report, because the AP42 CO factor is 0.13 pounds per ton, and that's significantly lower than the CO limit that's been proposed in the permit. The state has basically said, well, we don't think it can do 0.13 pounds per ton. We have other plants, but somewhere, it's 0.13 is a valid number, otherwise it wouldn't be an AP42. So I think the state, in this case, has not met its burden to demonstrate that the AP42 number is not RACT and cannot be achieved, and that's one of the comments that's in my written report. I didn't expand upon it in the presentation here, but that's in the written report, and I think the state could either needs to look at a lower CO number as RACT or provide adequate support that its decision that the 0.4 pounds per ton is indeed a RACT number, because it's clearly been, there are clearly asphalt batch plants that have lower CO emissions. It could be a number of factors. There could be altitude issues, because CO is really a product of incomplete combustion. So it may be that asphalt plants don't operate as efficiently at altitude and therefore would have higher CO numbers. There could be valid reasons for it. It's just not in the public record right now, and that's a shortcoming in the permit in my view.
Thank you.
Other questions? ESAB members? Fort Collins board members, any more questions? Okay, going once, going twice. Well, thank you, Howard. That was an excellent presentation. Appreciate you fielding all of our questions. So I think we're ready to adjourn the joint meeting. Michael, any differing thoughts from you?
No, I think we've covered everything that we intended to cover here.
Okay, great. Well, then we're going to adjourn the joint meeting. I entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. Second? All in favor? Aye. Okay. Joint meeting's adjourned. Thank you.